On a sunny spring morning in Central Park, a professional photographer was setting up his equipment near the bird sanctuary. As an avid bird enthusiast with over 15 years of experience capturing wildlife photos, he had arrived early to photograph the rare warbler migration that only happened twice a year. His expensive camera gear was carefully arranged on a nearby bench as he adjusted his telephoto lens. A middle-aged woman walking her poodle noticed him from across the path. Instead of continuing her morning stroll, she began watching him intently, clutching her purse closer to her body. The photographer, focused on his work, didn't immediately notice her suspicious glances. He was lost in thought, mentally planning the best angles to capture the birds in flight against the morning light. The woman started pacing nearby, occasionally making phone calls while keeping her eyes fixed on him. Other morning park visitors, joggers, dog walkers, and elderly couples, passed by without a second glance at the photographer, who was clearly absorbed in his hobby. His official photography vest, complete with multiple pockets filled with memory cards and filters, clearly indicated his purpose there. After about 20 minutes of surveillance, the woman approached a park security guard who was making his routine rounds. She gestured animatedly toward the photographer, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. The security guard, an experienced officer who had worked in the park for over a decade, listened patiently to her concerns while observing the photographer's completely normal and professional behavior. The situation escalated when the woman, unsatisfied with the security guard's measured response, pulled out her phone again. This time, she dialed 911, her voice rising as she reported what she claimed was suspicious behavior. The photographer, finally noticing the commotion, turned his camera away from the bird sanctuary to see what was happening. 2 police cars arrived within minutes, their presence drawing attention from other park visitors who stopped to watch the scene unfold. The officers approached the situation professionally, quickly assessing that they were dealing with a misunderstanding. The photographer calmly reached for his wallet, producing not only his ID but also his professional photography credentials and the morning's park permit. The woman's demeanor began to shift as she realized her grave error. The police officers, maintaining their professionalism, explained to her the serious nature of making false reports and the potential consequences of such actions. Other park regulars who had seen the photographer there many times before stepped forward, vouching for his character and frequent presence in the park. As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, the incident began drawing more attention. Several bystanders had recorded the interaction on their phones, capturing the woman's increasingly flustered attempts to justify her actions. The photographer, maintaining his dignity throughout the ordeal, simply asked for one thing: an honest apology and a moment to explain why her assumptions had been not just wrong, but harmful to the community. The crowd gathering around the scene had grown, with many park regulars recognizing the photographer from his frequent visits. A retired teacher who often watched birds with him stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion as she shared how the photographer had taught her grandson about wildlife photography just last weekend. She pulled out her phone, showing the officers the beautiful pictures her grandson had taken under his guidance. What the woman who made the call didn't know was that the photographer was actually a former military veteran who had discovered bird photography as a form of therapy after returning from overseas service. For the past 5 years, he had been running free weekend workshops teaching photography to troubled youth, helping them find purpose and creativity through the lens of a camera. The police officers, now fully understanding the situation, turned their attention to addressing the false report. One officer, pulling out his notepad, began explaining the serious legal consequences of misusing emergency services. "Ma'am," he said firmly but professionally, "making false reports isn't just wrong, it ties up emergency resources that could be needed for real emergencies." The woman's poodle, sensing the tension, had begun whimpering and tugging at its leash. Her hands shaking, the woman struggled to maintain her composure as she realized the magnitude of her actions. Several onlookers had their phones out, and she could hear whispers about another Karen incident and social media floating through the growing crowd. A young jogger who had stopped to watch the scene unfold stepped forward. She explained how the photographer had helped her capture stunning sunrise photos for her college photography project just last month. "He's here almost every morning," she said, her voice clear and confident. "He's helped so many of us learn about both photography and the local wildlife." The photographer, still maintaining his dignified composure, finally spoke up. His voice was steady and measured as he addressed not just the woman, but the entire gathered crowd. "I've been coming to this park for over 5 years," he began. "This is my sanctuary, my place of peace. But more importantly, it's our community's shared space. When we make assumptions about who belongs here and who doesn't, we damage the very fabric of our community." A park groundskeeper who had been watching from a distance approached, carrying a folder. Inside were photographs the photographer had given him over the years, stunning shots of the park through all seasons, many of which now hung in the park's visitor center. The groundskeeper explained how these photos had actually helped secure additional funding for park conservation efforts. The woman's face had turned pale as she listened to person after person step forward with their stories. Her earlier certainty had crumbled, replaced by the uncomfortable realization of her own prejudices. She looked around at the diverse group of people who had gathered, all united in their support of the photographer and their love for the park. A local news van had pulled up, attracted by the growing crowd. The reporter, recognizing the photographer from a previous story about his youth photography program, quickly grasped the situation's significance. This was no longer just about one incident in the park, it had become a moment of community solidarity and confronting uncomfortable truths. The police officers, after consulting with their supervisor over the radio, began wrapping up their investigation. They took detailed statements from multiple witnesses, ensuring everything was properly documented. One officer pulled the photographer aside, apologizing for the disruption to his morning and commending him for his composed handling of the situation. As the morning wore on, more park regulars arrived for their daily routines, each adding their own stories about the photographer's positive impact on the community. A group of bird watchers showed up with their logbooks, pointing out how his detailed photography had helped them track and protect the local bird populations. The woman, now visibly shaken by the overwhelming evidence of her mistake, stood rooted to the spot. Her poodle had settled down, sitting quietly by her feet as she faced the consequences of her actions. The photographer's request for an apology hung in the air, along with the unspoken question, their perspectives, turning the morning's incident into a learning moment. As the crowd formed a loose circle, the photographer finally shared more of his story. He spoke about his military service, his struggle with PTSD, and how photography had become his lifeline. He explained how the park's natural beauty and the community's warmth had helped him heal. His voice remained steady as he described the pain of being viewed as suspicious in a place he considered sanctuary. The woman, listening intently, felt tears welling up in her eyes. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her conscience as she heard story after story about the photographer's impact on the community. Her hands trembled as she raised them, asking for a chance to speak. The crowd fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. "I made a terrible mistake," she began, her voice breaking. "I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment. I didn't see a person, I saw my own assumptions, my own biases." She turned to face the photographer directly. "I not only wronged you, but I betrayed the spirit of this community. I understand now that my actions could have had devastating consequences." The local news team captured the raw emotion of the moment as the woman continued her heartfelt apology. She shared her own story, how recent crime reports had made her fearful, how she had let that fear override her humanity. But she acknowledged that fear was no excuse for prejudice, and that her actions had revealed biases she needed to confront. A community organizer who had arrived at the scene suggested turning this incident into an opportunity for growth. She proposed a series of community dialogues about bias and belonging, using photography as a medium for storytelling and understanding. The photographer, showing remarkable grace, offered to lead workshops that would bring together different members of the community to share their stories through pictures. The park administrator, who had been notified of the situation, arrived with an unexpected proposal. He suggested creating a permanent photography exhibition in the park's community center, featuring works that celebrated the diversity and unity of their neighborhood. The photographer's work would be the centerpiece, but it would include contributions from all community members. As the morning sun climbed higher, the gathering had transformed from a confrontation into a catalyst for change. The teenagers from the photography program began sharing their portfolios, showing pictures that captured the beauty of their diverse community. Each image told a story of connection, of seeing beyond surface appearances to the humanity beneath. The woman, moved by the spirit of reconciliation, made a bold suggestion. She offered to volunteer with the youth photography program, not as a photographer, but as someone willing to learn into an opportunity for positive change. The news reporter, recognizing the unique nature of this story's resolution, arranged for an extended segment focusing on community healing and transformation. She interviewed various participants, capturing the way a potential crisis had evolved into a moment of collective growth. The story was no longer about conflict, it had become a testament to the power of understanding and forgiveness. By early afternoon, the story had spread beyond the park's boundaries. Local news channels had picked up the live coverage, and social media was buzzing with clips of the morning's events. But unlike typical viral videos that often focused on conflict, these clips showcased something different, a community coming together, turning a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The park administration quickly organized an impromptu meeting in the community center. The space, usually quiet on weekday mornings, was now filled with passionate voices discussing ways to ensure everyone felt welcome in their shared green space. The photographer's students had set up an informal display of their work, images that captured the park's role as a gathering place for people from all walks of life. A city council member, who had rushed to the scene after seeing the news coverage, arrived with an unexpected proposal. She announced that the city was willing to fund a series of Community Through the Lens workshops, using photography as a tool for building bridges between different groups in the community. The photographer, still processing the morning's events, found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't anticipated. The woman who had made the call, now sitting quietly in the back of the room, raised her hand during the discussion. Her voice, though still shaky, carried a new sense of purpose. She shared how the morning's events had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. "I thought I was protecting the community," she admitted, "but I was actually damaging it. I want to be part of fixing that damage." A local business owner stepped forward with an offer to provide space for the photography exhibition in his coffee shop's gallery. Others quickly followed. A librarian offered to host photography workshops for seniors, a high school teacher suggested incorporating the program into their curriculum, and a tech company representative pledged to donate cameras for underprivileged youth. The police officers who had responded to the initial call remained involved, seeing an opportunity to strengthen community relations. The senior officer proposed regular, walk-and-talk sessions where officers would join the photographer and community members on photo walks through the park, breaking down barriers and building trust through shared experiences. As the afternoon progressed, the story continued to evolve. A documentary filmmaker who had been jogging in the park during the incident approached the photographer. She saw the potential for a larger story, not just about one morning's events, but about how communities can transform moments of conflict into catalysts for positive change. The teenagers from the photography program had been documenting everything since their arrival. Their photos captured the raw emotions, the tough conversations, and the moments of connection that had unfolded throughout the day. One particularly powerful image showed the woman and the photographer looking at photos together, their faces reflecting both pain and hope. The park groundskeeper, who had worked there for over 2 decades, shared his perspective with the gathering. He talked about how the park had always been a mirror of the community, reflecting both its challenges and its potential for unity. The morning's events, he suggested, were pushing them to look more closely at that reflection. Local religious leaders and community organizers who had arrived during the afternoon began planning a series of honest conversations events. They envisioned using the photographer's images as starting points for difficult but necessary discussions about prejudice, fear, and the possibility of change. The woman's poodle, who had remained quietly by her side throughout the day, became an unexpected symbol of the transformation taking place. Several people noticed how the dog, initially anxious and defensive like its owner, had gradually relaxed as the tension dissipated. A young photographer captured a touching image of the dog sitting calmly between its owner and the photographer as they talked. As the day drew to a close, the park began to fill with regular evening visitors who were surprised to find their usual space transformed into a hub of community activity. The story spread through conversations, each retelling emphasizing different aspects: the initial confrontation, the community's response, the paths to healing that were emerging. The next morning, the park had a different energy. News vans were still parked along the perimeter, but they weren't just covering a story about conflict anymore. Instead, cameras focused on something unexpected: dozens of people arriving early, carrying cameras of their own, ready to participate in an impromptu photography workshop that had been organized overnight through social media. The photographer arrived to find his usual quiet morning spot transformed into an outdoor classroom. People from all walks of life, retirees with expensive cameras, teenagers with smartphones, parents with children clutching disposable cameras, waited eagerly for guidance. The woman from yesterday's incident was there too, standing quietly at the edge of the group, her poodle watching curiously as people set up their equipment. A local coffee shop had sent over carafes of hot coffee and pastries, turning the morning gathering into an impromptu community breakfast. As people shared food and conversation, barriers began to break down. A retired executive asked a teenage student for help with his camera settings. A grandmother shared stories about the park's history with young parents who had just moved to the neighborhood. The photographer began the session by sharing his own journey, not just with photography, but with healing. He explained how looking through a lens had taught him to see beyond the surface, to find beauty in unexpected places. As he spoke, his students from the youth program circulated through the crowd, helping others adjust their cameras and offering encouragement to newcomers. The woman who had made the call yesterday raised her hand during a question period. Her voice was stronger now as she asked about the best way to capture images that tell stories of connection rather than division. The photographer invited her to join him near the bird sanctuary, where just yesterday their confrontation had begun. Together, they focused their cameras on a family of cardinals, red, bright, and unaware of human categories. Local businesses continued to step up throughout the morning. An art supply store sent over sketchbooks for people to journal alongside their photos. A printing shop offered to create a community photo book documenting the transformation taking place. Even the hot dog vendor who usually didn't arrive until lunchtime showed up early, providing free drinks to the growing crowd. The police officers who had responded yesterday returned, but this time in civilian clothes, carrying their own cameras. They shared stories about their experiences seeing the community through different lenses, both as protectors and as neighbors. One officer, a hobby photographer himself, talked about how photography had helped him process the emotional toll of his work. As the morning progressed, the workshop naturally evolved into small groups scattered throughout the park. Near the fountain, a group of seniors taught younger participants about composition and patience. By the lake, children excitedly photographed ducks while their parents chatted with strangers who had become friends. The woman's poodle had become an unexpected photography subject, with several people capturing images of the dog's playful interactions with other park visitors. The local news crew, still following the story, found themselves becoming part of it. Their cameraman, touched by the scene, began offering technical tips to aspiring photographers. The reporter set aside her microphone to learn about wildlife photography from the teenager who had once been too shy to speak on camera. A social worker who had joined the gathering shared how she planned to incorporate photography into her therapy sessions, inspired by how the morning's activities had brought people together. She observed how the simple act of looking through a lens had helped people step outside their own perspectives and see the world through others' eyes. The park administrator, watching the scene unfold, made an official announcement. The park would establish a permanent photography program, with weekly workshops and monthly exhibitions. More importantly, they would create a community council to ensure the park remained a welcoming space for everyone, with the photographer and the woman who had called the police both invited to serve as founding members. As noon approached, participants gathered to share their morning's work. Images flashed across phones and camera screens, candid shots of people learning together, close-ups of flowers and birds, portraits that captured genuine emotions. But perhaps the most powerful photo was taken by a young student. It showed the photographer and the woman standing side by side, both focused on helping a child learn to use a camera. Their previous conflict transformed into collaboration. A week after the incident, the park's community center hosted its first official council meeting. The room was packed with people sitting in folding chairs, standing along walls, and spilling out into the hallway. The energy was different from typical community meetings. There was an air of possibility rather than complaint, of building rather than dividing. The woman who had made the call arrived early, helping to set up chairs and arrange refreshments. She had spent the week reflecting deeply on her actions and their consequences. Her poodle, now wearing a therapy dog certification vest, accompanied her. During the week, she had enrolled in a therapy dog training program, inspired by how her pet had helped break down barriers during the photography workshop. The photographer entered carrying a large portfolio of images captured over the past week. These weren't just nature photos anymore, they told the story of a community in transformation. There were shots of elderly residents teaching young children about birds, teenagers showing seniors how to use smartphone cameras, and police officers joining morning photo walks with residents. A representative from the city council presented the official charter for the new community initiative they were calling Through Different Lenses. The program would extend beyond photography, using art as a tool for building understanding across different communities. 3 other parks in the city had already requested similar programs, inspired by the viral videos and news coverage of their success. During the meeting, people shared stories of how the past week had changed their perspectives. A business owner admitted that he used to hurry through the park, focused on his phone, barely noticing others. Now he arrived early for work each day to join the morning photography group. His shop's walls were already filling with community photos, drawing customers into conversations about more than just coffee. The police department announced a new training program, developed in consultation with the photographer and community leaders. Officers would participate in monthly photography walks, not as authority figures, but as community members learning to see their beat through a different lens. The senior officer who had handled the original incident shared how this approach was already changing police community dynamics. Local schools had caught wind of the initiative. A high school principal spoke about implementing a photography club that would bring together students from different backgrounds. The woman who had made the call volunteered to share her story with students, turning her mistake into a lesson about assumptions and redemption. The documentary filmmaker who had been following the story presented a short clip of her work in progress. The footage showed intimate moments of connection and change, the woman and the photographer looking through photos together, teenagers teaching seniors about digital cameras, community members who had never spoken before sharing stories over coffee and pastries. A surprising announcement came from a tech company representative. Impressed by the organic growth of the program, they pledged to create a digital platform where communities across the country could share similar stories and strategies. The photographer would serve as an advisor, helping other communities use photography as a tool for building bridges. The woman stood up to speak, her voice steady now. She shared how the past week had changed not just her actions but her entire worldview. Her daily dog walks, once filled with suspicion of strangers, had become opportunities for connection. She described how her poodle's therapy dog training was teaching her as much about patience and acceptance as it was teaching her pet. The park administrator presented plans for a permanent outdoor gallery space, where weather-protected displays would showcase rotating exhibitions of community photography. The first installation would tell the story of their transformation, beginning with images from the day of the incident and continuing through the positive changes that followed. As the meeting continued, small working groups formed to address different aspects of the initiative. One group focused on youth engagement, another on senior citizens' participation, and a third on connecting with neighboring communities. The photographer moved between groups, offering insights while ensuring that every voice was heard. The local news team, still following the story, noted how different this was from typical community meetings they covered. Instead of complaints about parking or noise, people were actively engaging in solution building. The reporter observed that even the way people sat had changed, not in opposing sides, but in mixed groups, sharing ideas across traditional boundaries. 1 month after the incident, the park had become a model for community transformation. The morning sun now regularly rose over groups of photographers of all ages and backgrounds, sharing techniques and stories as they captured the day's first light. The early morning photography sessions had become so popular that people began arriving before dawn, forming friendships over thermoses of coffee and shared experiences. The woman's journey had taken an unexpected turn. Her poodle, now a certified therapy dog, had become a regular fixture at community events. Together, they visited schools where she shared her story with students, teaching them about the courage it takes to admit mistakes and the power of transformation. The dog's gentle presence helped create a safe space for difficult conversations about prejudice and change. The documentary filmmaker's work had caught the attention of a major streaming service. Film crews now followed key community members, capturing the ripple effects of that fateful morning. But unlike typical viral stories that flared and faded, this one continued to deepen. The filmmaker focused on the small, daily moments of change, a former skeptic becoming a community leader, teenagers finding their voice through photography, seniors connecting with young neighbors. The photography program had expanded beyond anything they'd imagined. Local businesses had created a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth interested in photography. The woman who had made the call became one of its most passionate fundraisers, turning her network of contacts into a resource for positive change. Her own transformation had become a powerful tool for convincing others to support the initiative. The police department's new approach had started showing measurable results. Officers reported improved relationships with community members, and emergency calls about suspicious persons had decreased significantly. The senior officer who had handled the original incident now led workshops for other precincts, using photography as a tool for building trust between law enforcement and communities. The park's new outdoor gallery had become a destination for visitors from across the city. Weather-protected displays showcased photographs that told stories of community life, children playing, seniors sharing wisdom, families celebrating, and strangers becoming friends. Each image was accompanied by a story, creating a living history of their neighborhood's transformation. The tech platform promised by the tech company had launched, connecting similar initiatives across the country. The photographer found himself mentoring community leaders from other cities, sharing not just photography techniques but strategies for using art to bridge divides. Weekly video calls connected their local success with growing movements in other communities. Local schools reported positive changes too. The photography club had expanded into a full-scale program where students documented community life and explored different perspectives through their lenses. Teachers noticed improved empathy and communication among students who participated, and the program became part of the district's anti-bias curriculum. The woman's poodle had inspired a new dimension to the program. Other dog owners began bringing their pets to photography sessions, finding that the animals helped break down barriers between strangers. The park administration designated specific areas as pet-friendly photography zones, where people could practice their skills while their dogs socialized. The documentary captured a particularly moving moment, and the woman and the photographer co-led a workshop for new community members. They stood side by side, sharing their story not as an incident of conflict, but as proof that transformation was possible. Their easy rapport and genuine friendship spoke louder than any planned message about overcoming prejudice. Mental health professionals had taken notice of the program's impact. Research teams from local universities began studying how community photography programs could help reduce social anxiety and build connections across demographic divides. The woman's journey from fear to leadership became a case study in how confronting bias could lead to personal growth. The park itself had physically transformed. New benches and gathering spaces encouraged interaction, while educational signs explained the history of their community initiative. The bird sanctuary where the incident began had been enhanced with viewing platforms and information about local wildlife, turning it into a space for both photography and education. 6 months after the incident, the park hosted a special evening event to premiere the documentary. Hundreds gathered on the Great Lawn, sitting on blankets and folding chairs, while the film played on a massive outdoor screen. The audience represented every facet of the community: families with young children, teenagers, elderly couples, business owners, police officers, and visitors from other cities hoping to learn from their experience. The documentary began with the raw footage from that fateful morning but quickly evolved into a story of transformation. On screen, the woman watched herself change from someone ruled by fear into a community leader who now conducted workshops on overcoming bias. Her poodle, now a celebrated therapy dog, sat calmly beside her as images of their journey played across the screen. The photographer's role had grown far beyond teaching camera techniques. He had become a bridge builder, helping other communities replicate their success. The film showed him speaking at national conferences, but also captured quiet moments of him still teaching local children about birds and photography in the early morning light. His military background, once a source of pain, had become part of his strength in bringing structure and purpose to community programs. The police department's transformation took center stage in one segment. Officers spoke candidly about how the photography program had changed their approach to community policing. Statistics showed a 70% decrease in bias-related calls, while community engagement had increased significantly. Other police departments had begun sending representatives to learn from their experience. The tech platform connecting similar initiatives across the country had grown to include over 50 cities. The film showed video calls between community leaders sharing strategies and success stories. What had started as a response to one incident had become a movement, with their park serving as a model for how communities could heal and grow stronger through art and understanding. Local businesses reported unexpected benefits. The coffee shop that had first offered wall space for community photos had become a popular destination, with visitors coming from other neighborhoods to see the latest exhibitions. Other businesses had followed suit, turning the area into a cultural district that celebrated community art and connection. The Woman's Therapy Dog program had expanded beyond their initial goals. The film showed her poodle working with anxiety-prone children learning photography, helping seniors feel comfortable in group settings, and even assisting in police training sessions about community engagement. Other dog owners had followed her lead, creating a network of therapy animals that supported community programs. University researchers studying the initiative presented their findings during the documentary. Their data showed measurable improvements in community cohesion, reduced anxiety levels among participants, and increased cross-cultural understanding. The program was becoming a case study in how communities could address bias and build connections through shared creative experiences. The park itself had become a living testament to their journey. New signs marked significant spots: the bird sanctuary where it all began, the community center where the first meeting was held, the outdoor gallery that now stretched along main pathways. Each location told part of their story while continuing to create new ones. Perhaps the most powerful segment focused on the youth impact. Teenagers who had struggled with identity and belonging spoke about finding their voice through photography. The film showed them leading workshops for adults, their confidence growing as they shared their perspectives through their chosen medium. Several had received college scholarships based on portfolios documenting their community's transformation. The documentary's conclusion brought everything full circle. The woman and the photographer, now close friends, sat together on a park bench at dawn, watching new photographers gather for the morning session. Their conversation reflected on how a moment of conflict had led to profound change. Not just for them but for an entire community. As the credits rolled and the screen went dark, the park itself seemed to glow with possibility. String lights twinkled in the trees, and people lingered, sharing stories and making plans for future projects. The incident that could have divided them had instead become the catalyst for a deeper kind of community, one built on understanding, creativity, and the willingness to see through different lenses.